Good morning, everyone. My name is Rod Dyer, and this is an interview with my friend, mentor, and partner of some 50 years, Peter Millham. We're at the UNH Law Center in Concord, and it's a beautiful day on July 22, 2014. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Rod.
It's a pleasure to see you, as I have had that pleasure for 50 odd years, literally. Yeah. And Peter, I suppose we should just go briefly into some of your background. I understand you're a New York boy, is that correct?
That's right. I grew up on Long Island. Actually, I was born in Brooklyn, and we moved out to Long Island when I was 7. And I lived in the country then. It was not known as country in the area, but I consider it more country than the city. So, and I lived there until basically I graduated from college and went in the Army, and then went to law school.
Well, that's a pretty brief description. I understand that one or more of your parents or grandparents were also lawyers, is that correct?
Yeah, my great-grandfather was a lawyer. He was also a college professor. He was an county attorney out in Wisconsin in the late 1800s. My grandfather was a lawyer and also the commissioner of insurance in New York State. My father was a lawyer in New York City, and thus I am a lawyer.
Right. So that's 4 generations.
Yes.
Who have been to the, past the bar and become practicing lawyers. I actually believe there's a 5th generation. Is that correct?
Well, true. My daughter Ann is a lawyer. She's down in Pennsylvania at the present time.
And as far as college is concerned, I believe you went to St. Lawrence?
I went to St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York.
And there's also a family history as far as St. Lawrence is concerned.
That's true. I was a 4th generation, and my son Fred was 5th generation. Yeah. I think that has now gone awry because my two daughters went to Bates and Dartmouth, and my son, who went to St. Lawrence, married a Harvard graduate, and both of his kids have gone to Harvard. So
the connection seems to be lost.
But, I think that the Millham connection is gone.
Yeah. However, you do have a continuing connection as far as St. Lawrence, because that's where you met your wife.
That's right. Both, and Elida's family also had, her father and mother were St. Lawrence graduates, and her brother and she both. Yeah. She's not exactly a graduate because she was part of a program of nursing education, which 2 years at St. Lawrence and then 2 years at 3 years at Columbia School of Nursing.
So I believe you, were you married before you went to law school?
No, I was married between my 2nd and 3rd year of law school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And Elida has had an interesting career in and of herself, has she not?
Yes. She's did work for the visiting nurse service in New York for the first year of our marriage, which was my last year of law school. And she also at one point worked for the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. Since then, when we moved to Laconia, she was pregnant with our first child, and after that, she didn't work for a number of years, and then she began, well, let's say she saved the visiting nurse service as it was in Laconia. It was then became Community Health and Hospice, as she was the executive director. And matter of fact, at one point you were a trustee of the
That's correct.
organization. So she worked there for, I think, 16 years and then retired early and became, within a few years, ran for the House of Representatives in New Hampshire and served for 12 years. Her final year, she was the chairman of the Belknap County delegation.
Now, you went to Columbia Law School, is that correct?
Correct.
And you graduated. How did a person like you, a New York born and bred, who had antecedents in New York State, end up in Laconia of New Hampshire, of all places?
Well, it wasn't that easy. But when I was at St. Lawrence, one of my roommates was Harold Westcott Jr. from Laconia. And his father was Judge Harold Westcott. And he retired from the bench, I think, in 1957. And before long, he needed some help. And through Harold Jr., I came up here between my I think it was my second and third year in law school to work with Judge Westcott as a clerk. And as a result of that, I was interested in coming here because I did not want to practice in New York City. And I'm quite sure that my father expected me to practice with him, but I disappointed him. Mm-hmm. And we came up here and I've been very happy, and I think my wife has. Our children have grown up in Guilford, and they have been good kids,
mm-hmm. Yes.
good parents.
I can attest to that. What were the early days like practicing with Judge Westcott? I assume it was just Judge Westcott and yourself.
That's right. We started out in a small office. Judge Westcott had taken over the practice of Judge Keller, who also was from Laconia, and he had taken Judge Westcott's place on the court, on the Superior Court. And so Judge Westcott got most of his clients when they switched. And being an associate for Judge Westcott was, I think, kind of a special experience because he was well respected by all the clerks of court that you dealt with, so they treated me well. And also, I think I learned a lot from him. Yeah. I recall I was admitted to the bar on January 1st. In the first part of October, he gave me 2 files for cases that were due to be tried in the following week. He said, here, work on these, get them ready to try. So I began working. And the next day, I went to see if I could ask him some questions about the facts in the file. And it turned out he had gone on vacation for a week. So there was nothing for me to do but to do all the work that was necessary, try the cases, and learn the hard way or the easy way, whatever it is. But at any rate, I learned how to try cases, and I tried quite a few of them over the years.
He was a man of incredible depth.
Yes.
Was he not?
Right.
And but somewhat acerbic personality.
Well, he was very Republican,
Right.
and he feared I was a Democrat, which I was at first. Mm-hmm. And I remember when, after you came into the firm and you were also a Republican, that he would make sure that I wasn't within hearing distance when you talked to him or he talked to you about Republican business.
How true.
So
you start out as an associate, and then at some point Harold asks you to be a partner, and the firm becomes Westcott and Millham at that time. What was the court system like in those days? For example, can you tell me, you know, about the Superior Court system? You know, the
Right.
clerks of court, the roll, you know, the roll calls that would occur, and so on and so forth.
The system was quite different than it is today. Not so much in the formality, but in the informality. Each county had a clerk and a clerk's office, and the judges, there were 7 Superior Court judges. And they
entire
rode
state.
in the state. They rode circuit. So that, for instance, Laconia would have its sessions, court sessions, during the months of October and November, and maybe a week or so in December. And then the next time would be in March and April, perhaps. That would be the Laconia sessions. Meantime, most of us who tried cases would try them in all the surrounding counties as well. So we would go to Ossipee for Carroll County trials. Mm-hmm. And in Grafton County, there were 3 terms. There was Lebanon, Woodsville, and Plymouth. Plymouth was in the spring and was quite a nice session to be at. One thing that they did then that they don't do now is to have a call of the list. And that's the list of all the cases to be tried. And each county, that one day would be set aside for the call of the list, and all the lawyers would go to that were on the list, and others would go to that call, and the clerk would call off each case, and the lawyers involved would respond by saying it's ready for trial or it isn't, and why. And there was one firm that usually would say that that's so-and-so's case, and then so-and-so was not there usually. So that was always kind of interesting. But basically, you'd have the call of the docket, and the cases would be assigned for trial. And then that evening, there would be a meeting of the bar, a dinner meeting. And all of the people in the county who were lawyers would go to that meeting, as would most of the lawyers who'd come to the call of the docket. And it would be a fine social event. We'd get to talk to everybody. Right. That time, there were probably around 400 or 500 lawyers in the state. So you'd know a good portion of them. There were, for instance, I think 20 to 25 lawyers in Belknap County. Well, now there are more than 100. And same thing as you go around the state, you got to know a fair number of lawyers. So did I know half of them? Maybe. And then you go to bar events and so on. So it was you knew what lawyers you could trust and what lawyers you couldn't trust. And most of them you could trust. Belknap County Bar was famous for being a congenial bar where we got along with each other, we trusted each other, and occasionally somebody would come in and that wasn't trustworthy, and somehow or other they'd leave.
They'd be somewhat ostracized.
Ostracized, and you know, if the other lawyers don't trust you, it's hard to do business with them. So.
Speaking of friendly bars, there's a rumor to the effect that up in Grafton County, that on the day of the call of the docket, there might be a poker game or something that occurred?
Well, I don't know. To me, that's not a rumor because I saw it. Oh. They used to have I'm going to say it was the fall session. They would have their dinner and party at the house of one of the bar members out on a little lake up in northern New Hampshire. And we would have, the judge would play poker, the clerk would play poker, the sheriff would play poker, and of course some of the lawyers would play poker. So it was very friendly.
The scandal is coming out as we speak.
Well, I'm not
But
sure.
this was 50 years ago.
It wasn't scandalous.
40 years
because
ago.
that year, in those days,
Yeah.
there was a much better relationship, or closer relationship, of the judges to the lawyers, particularly the trial lawyers. They knew you, you knew them. They would ask, you would talk about your families. You would meet the judges in their chambers. They would have conferences in their chambers, and they would invite all of the lawyers involved to do it. And you would not only talk about the issue to be discussed, but also other issues, that was what was going on in the bar or in law or in your family. So it was much more informal. And I believe that the judges and the clerks knew who could be trusted and who couldn't be.
Right.
If you were to mislead the court, you would not be trusted.
Or the clerk.
Or the clerk would not.
I mean, the clerks in those days, did they not have, a lot of discretion as to how cases would be scheduled?
Yeah,
And
indeed. If you had a problem with your scheduling, you went to the clerk, and the clerk, if they liked you and trusted you, would work things out so that your schedule could be changed to suit you. We at times had maybe 10 jury cases set for 1 week. And of course, they weren't going to reach them all. But they were always worried that there would come a day when a case settled, and they didn't have something to give to the jury to keep them busy. So you really, during that period, it was difficult to keep your witnesses in line. You either had to have them at the court, or you had to have them at least agreeing to be present on any day of that week. And you'd call them every day to tell them when the case was, how it looked like the case was going to be heard, when. And of course, it was particularly difficult if your witness had to come in from a long distance, like Florida or someplace.
right, correct.
So that was corrected, well, before I stopped trying cases.
And as you indicated, the bar was much smaller.
That's right.
And there were not only the county lawyers that you dealt with in the three counties predominantly, but there were also traveling lawyers that would come up from Concord or Manchester in particular. Is that correct?
That's true. There were lawyers who were known as trial lawyers, whether they came from some of the big firms in Manchester or Concord. And of course, the big firms then were only
6 or 7.
6 or 7 lawyers,
Right.
not like they are today.
That's true.
We knew all of those lawyers fairly well. We would have dinner with them or lunch with them from time to time, might have a drink with them. And you knew the customs of some of the lawyers trying cases. For instance, there was one lawyer from Manchester who always would not settle a case until he'd seen the jury. He said, I want to see the jury, see what they look like. And then you could settle a case with them.
Yep, correct.
Settlement of cases was different then. You could settle some cases before going to court, but a lot of them settled at either the pretrial hearings or just before you drew the jury, or even after you drew the jury. And you'd go into the judge's chamber, and the judge would ask about what offers had been made, what the facts were in the case. And then, contrary to what it is today, the judge would say, well, that sounds like a pretty good offer. And if the judge told you that, you'd go out and talk to your client and would give you a little support in settling the case. You know, the judge thinks this is a good offer. Well, that would impress the client, and maybe they'd take the offer and we could settle it. But they were more involved in the settlement of the cases than they are today.
Than it appears to be today. Well, as far as you not only tried cases in the Superior Court system in those days, but you also, I know, tried a number of cases in what were then the municipal courts, correct?
Correct.
Can you tell me a little about your experiences and how the municipal courts worked?
Well, the municipal courts were, by and large, except for in the cities, where the judges were non-lawyers, laymen. Some of them were good, and some of them weren't so good. In Laconia, it being a city, the municipal court had lawyers as judges. But interestingly enough, the courtroom, when I first started there, was, the office of the chief of police. When it was day for court, and court was usually started at 8 o'clock in the morning or something, 7:30, the chief of police would vacate his office and the judge would come in and take his desk. And I remember there was one time when somebody mentioned that the judge had said something and the client said, "You mean Mickey's," Mickey was the chief of police, "Mickey's secretary." So they had the impression that the judge was somehow connected to the police, which wasn't a good thing to have, and we haven't had that in many years. But anyway, the typical day for me as a young general practitioner, and it was truly a general practice, we did everything. I would start by going to the Laconia District Court, and I might try a speeding case, a DWI case, an assault case, some case and it would take less than an hour to try those cases. Then after the judge gave the decision, you would leave, and then I would stop maybe at the Registry of Deeds on my way back to the office and search a title. Then you'd go back to the office and do office work. And you might do a deposition later in the day or something of that nature, or interview a witness. And of course, since we did criminal work as well as civil work, a lot of times we would go to the jail and interview our clients or witnesses. So it was a very varied practice. And one of the things about it that I found particularly interesting and made me like it was that when you got up in the morning, you never knew what you were going to be dealing with that day. There were some things you knew you were going to be dealing with, but people would come in off the street with cases of different natures, matters of different natures, so that you were always doing something different. And that to me was a lot of fun.
And not only did you practice in the municipal and superior court, but over the years, I believe you had an active practice in Supreme Court appearances.
Yeah. Well, of course, when you have cases in the Superior Court, you or the other side are not always happy with the result. And in those days, you merely had to file the necessary filing for an appeal to go to the Supreme Court. And a lot of cases were appealed. So I would say that over the course of my career, I've argued probably 50 cases more or less in the Supreme Court.
Were you comfortable in doing that?
Well, whether it was the fact that Judge Westcott I was his associate or not, I can recall the first time that I appeared in the Supreme Court. Of course, we took the bar exam in the Supreme Court chambers.
That's correct.
And some of us sat at the judge's desk, because there were only, this is off the subject a little bit, but there were only, I think, 24 people taking the bar a year. And that was all done in late June, early July. And for my bar exam, I think only 12 people passed. So that meant only 12 new lawyers coming in
For the
a
entire
year.
state.
So that helped us to know each other. But anyway, came in, and Judge Kennison was the Chief Justice, and he was, of course, a very well thought of Chief Justice, not only in New Hampshire, but around the country. And he gave me a very warm welcome, and then you went forward and did your argument, and I felt very comfortable. I always felt very comfortable making my argument in the Supreme Court. I had personal experience with, as time went on, more and more of the judges, like Judge Batchelder, Judge Johnson. Both of them, I had tried many cases before.
In the Superior Court.
In the Superior Court,
Yeah.
both in Belknap County and Grafton County. Later on, Judge, a fellow from down in Nashua.
May I prompt you?
Yes.
And suggest Sherman Horton?
Sherm Horton. I had worked with Sherm on many cases. He'd been on the Professional Conduct Committee with me, and we had been a subcommittee that had devised the continued legal education requirements and so on.
Can you think of maybe a notable case that perhaps ended up in the New Hampshire Supreme Court that you were involved in?
Well, the most notable, I guess, would be the Bricker cases. Dr. Bricker had come to New Hampshire from New York State, and he was a very intelligent fella, and he worked out of Ashland. He lived in Ashland and practiced in the Skeever Spear Memorial Hospital in Plymouth. When he moved here, he had apparently been doing some legal work for medical legal work in New York. And he started appearing as a witness in medical cases and also in medical malpractice cases. And medical malpractice cases were very hard to win as a plaintiff in those days, because you had to satisfy the requirement that the doctor had been less careful or used a standard. The standard to be used was that of the locality. So that if you were practicing in a locale where their standards were lower, you could be a little more careless than you were if you practiced where they were higher. And it was not accepted in the medical profession to testify against your fellow doctors. So anyway, my first connection with him was once, I think you were involved. He was called as a witness in a case, as a medical witness, that was not a medical malpractice case, but involved, I think, a police chief who had been taken down to the state hospital.
That's correct. By his own police department.
Yeah, and it was questionable whether or not he had been treated properly. And I believe you were the attorney for representing him.
That's correct.
And I think his wife was upset that he was doing it, and she had asked me to see if I could get him not to testify. But anyway, I think he did testify eventually.
Yes, he did.
And
that set him off on his
Right.
career in New Hampshire.
so anyway, later on, I became involved when Walter Murphy, who later became a Superior Court Justice, was practicing in Plymouth in what had been the office of Batchelder and Murphy. And he called and he said that he needed some help because he had a hearing coming up quickly with Dr. Bricker and the Skiva Spear Hospital. Skiva Spear Hospital had refused to appoint him to be allowed to practice in that hospital. And he was suing the hospital, and the hospital initially had Walter as its attorney. So he called me to help him with that, and within a short time, Walter was in a bind because he had some tort cases in which the plaintiff was represented by Dr. Bricker, or Dr. Bricker was required to appear as a witness. So Walter gave me the case, and I handled the case through its many iterations. It involved whether Dr. Bricker was properly appointed or not, or actually not appointed to the staff of the hospital. So they brought a suit. The first time it was tried before Judge Johnson in Grafton County, and I was not successful. The hospital, I was representing the hospital. It was successful, and Dr. Bricker was not successful. That was appealed to the Supreme Court, and that was the first of the many iterations. The Supreme Court upheld Judge Johnson's decision. But for many years thereafter, Dr. Bricker would re-examine the record and re-examine the documents that were in that case. And he would always seem to find something that the court hadn't properly considered. And he would ask for the court to reconsider. And he must have done that 3 or 4 times, going to the Supreme Court. First he, I think, went to the Superior Court, and then he would go to the Supreme Court. At any rate, it would always wind up with a Supreme Court decision upholding the lower court's decision. And Dr. Bricker wound up disappointed. Finally, he decided he would sue everybody under the sun. He eventually sued Skiva Spear Hospital, the 3 lawyers, including Walter Murphy and I, and give me the name of the doctor's lawyer.
Irving Soden.
Irving Soden.
Right.
And he sued Laconia Hospital at some point, but I don't think that was it. At any rate, that case went into the federal court, and the federal court threw it out, and it was appealed to the federal district court in Boston, and we were successful there. The thing I liked about that case was that it was written up in the newspaper, how he had brought suit against all these entities, and that the newspaper referred to the 3 lawyers as prominent New Hampshire lawyers. And that was the first time I had ever been recognized. as a prominent New Hampshire lawyer.
Congratulations.
And probably the last time I was ever recognized
Yeah.
as a prominent
Right.
New Hampshire lawyer.
Yeah.
But at any rate,
Right.
that was kind of a
Right.
kick.
Just as an aside, let's just explore our relationship very briefly. As I said at the outset, you and I have practiced law together for now 50 years. And I came into the office in 1964. Do you remember the first day that I arrived?
I remember the first day you didn't arrive on time. Judge Westcott and I were early morning practitioners. We get there 7:30 or so. And the first day you were to appear, we sort of wait around. Where's Rodney? What's happening? How come he wasn't there? And you appeared, I think, around 9 o'clock.
That's
And
correct.
I don't think you ever appeared after 7:30 thereafter.
I can assure you it never happened again.
Yeah.
I thought in those days that because I had been in another law firm that was the time you started practice. But I quickly caught on to that. And as I indicated, you and I have practiced for the past 50 years. We had a 25th anniversary celebration where we cut the cake together.
That's right.
And I think there's a picture of that on this video. And we've had a great and lasting friendship and relationship over the years. You're not a one-dimensional person. In other words, you certainly have had a very interesting career as a lawyer, Peter, but you've done other things in your life. You've raised an exceptional family. Your wife has had an outstanding career in and of herself. And you've been the mentor of our law firm throughout the years as attorneys have come and gone. And I know that you've been involved in other community affairs, so perhaps you could just briefly outline some of the things that you've done in the community or in the state.
I think that in the first years I was practicing, it was much lawyers and doctors were much more apt to be involved in community affairs, to be, on the hospital board, on the Red Cross board, and things of that nature. I think my first board I was chair of the Laconia Red Cross, and that was probably within a year or so of my arrival. Laconia Red Cross is now part of the New Hampshire Red Cross, I guess, so there is no longer a local one. I was president of the hospital, or chairman of the board of the hospital. Early on, I was appointed to the Belknap County Recreation Area Commission, which today is the Gunstock Commission. That commission managed the ski area and park, now known as Gunstock. And it continues to exist as the Gunstock Commission. That was a particularly interesting thing because you were actually acting as a board of trustees for a business, or board of directors for a business. There were 5 of us, and each one was appointed for a 5-year term overlapping. And I was appointed for 3 years, which has become the common appointment. 3 terms, which has become common. And I found it to be just a very interesting job. I've also been Commodore of the Yacht Club. I've been perhaps the most enjoyable for 40 years, 39 consecutively. I was the
Moderator.
Of the town of Guilford, which meant that I not only ran the town meetings, but I also was responsible for running the elections and voting. And I found that I enjoyed the town meetings. I enjoyed the give and take, and
there was a lot of give and take.
that's
Some
right.
of the mavericks in town, and, every town, in my opinion, from my experience, has, shall we say, fairly vocal people.
Right.
And Guilford was no different.
I tried to make sure that everybody had their chance to say what they wanted to say, and were in order. There was, in later years, one person who would not sit down when I asked them to sit down after they'd had their 10 minutes of speechifying, and they were, if anybody did anything they didn't like, they would accuse them of criminal activity, that it was a crime they had done. So the first time, he wouldn't sit down. He insisted on standing up. The police chief came to see if he couldn't quiet him down and make him sit down. And he said, "No, you'll have to arrest me." So what could the chief do but to arrest him? Took him out, and that was it. He was arrested for, I think, disturbing the peace. And later, the case was tried in Franklin District Court, and the case was upheld. I thought that probably would take care of him, and he would be moderated somewhat. But within a few years, he was back doing the same thing, and I asked the chief to see if he could just remove him and not have to arrest him. But once again, he made the same statement. So in general, people were very cooperative, and they wanted the moderator to be in control. And I think that they elected me for 40 years, or 39 years. The first year I was appointed. So I think I did a good job, and I think that I know the town appreciated it.
As a Guilford resident, I would echo that.
Yeah.
Peter, if I drive up to the summit of Mount Washington, I will see a plaque in the Summit House, and your name is on it. Why is that?
Well, I'd forgotten about that. I was appointed to the Governor's Mount Washington Committee, which was, I can't remember what year that might have been, but it was appointed by Judge King. I was appointed by not Judge King, then Governor King. And the committee was to resolve what should happen to the top of Mount Washington, because it was there were all kinds of buildings being built up there. It was becoming sort of a junkyard, particularly if you looked at it from the distance. And eventually that committee recommended the building that has been built up there as sort of a museum for the mountaintop, and the other improvements that were made up there as a state park. Of course, it still contains the Mount Washington Observatory, the railroad, and the toll road, and I think several of the radio or TV stations still broadcast from up there. Mm-hmm. But that was a very interesting group, and the members of that committee's names are there. They were there was an ex-governor, an ex-assistant to the president, who had been involved in the Vicuna Coat case.
Former governor of New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah.
it was an
Interesting times.
interesting time.
So the point is, you have not been simply one-dimensional
That's right.
as far as your career is concerned. And as a matter of fact, you've also, I believe, taken an active role in New Hampshire bar matters over the years.
Yes, I was twice elected to the Board of Governors in separate times. Also, I was on the Professional Conduct Committee before it was a committee of the Supreme Court, but when it was a bar committee. And then I stayed on it when it became a committee of the Supreme Court for a number of years. I've tried some cases for the bar, for that committee. And also I tried I tried a case for the board, the judicial board of.
Well, you were a prosecutor, were you not?
Yes, I prosecuted.
Yeah. It was that, and I happened to look it up, so that was against the Judge Snow.
Yeah, that was a Snow case,
Yeah.
which is often cited as probably the only case that's been to the Supreme Court when the judges are behavior is
Right.
questioned.
And there was a concern about whether or not he had violated the judicial canon of ethics, as
That's
I
right.
recall.
And the Judicial Committee had found that he had, and then the Supreme Court found that he had as well.
I think I wrote down the citation if anyone is interested in it, and I think it's 140 New Hampshire 618, and it's an interesting case, and it's worthy of reading just for ethical considerations, whether you're a lawyer or a sitting judge.
That case brings back to me that case was covered by the press, and there were the Supreme Court was full. The seating area was full for that case. But going back to the 60s, television was not readily available in the country up here.
Correct.
When I'm talking about the country and the country towns. In Laconia area, we had a cable system, but you had to have your own antenna, and with the mountains and so on, all the channels were not available. So the district court, or let's call them the municipal courts. What were they? Was it a municipal court?
They
Municipal
were
court.
municipal courts.
The municipal courts in the communities were often sources of entertainment, as was the Superior Court. I mean, we'd be trying a case in there, and people would come in off the street just to be entertained. And the municipal courts were similar to that. People would come in, to hear the drunken driving cases or whatever. And in Ossipee, the district court sat on Saturday night.
Wasn't that convenient?
Yes. And I raised that issue with the judge one time. I had won, basically, I know I had won the case because actually it was the water cops who had brought somebody in for offense on the lake. And I had gone over there with them and defended them, and the evidence was deficient. They forgot to introduce some piece of evidence that was essential to the statute that was being violated. And I pointed that out to the judge after the state rested and rested. And he said, well, what do you say about that to the prosecutor, who was also a water police? What do we call those? Marine police.
New Hampshire Marine Patrol.
Marine Patrol. And he said, well, blah, 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 so-and-so can answer that. I said, well, where's so-and-so? Well, he isn't here. So the judge continued the case for another week or 2 weeks to allow them to come up with the evidence. And I raised it with the judge. I said, Judge, we're here. It's a Saturday night. My clients are here. We've tried this case. If they wanted to put the evidence on, they can put the evidence on. They should have. They didn't. He said, well, they can do it. I said, well, Judge, it's kind of inconvenient to come over here on a Saturday night. And he says, inconvenient? I run this case, hold this court on a Saturday night for the convenience of the traveling public so they can get here. So obviously I was not successful. I had to go back,
Right.
but I was successful in the end.
It's called rough justice.
Yeah. And, you would go to, for instance, in the town of Belmont, there was a lay judge, and he would also often ask the chief, who was Chief Sweeney.
Earl Sweeney.
Earl Sweeney, who today is still very active as
That's correct.
I think he's the Deputy Director of Safety.
Yeah.
And Earl and I were good friends, but this judge would say, well, what do you think of that, Earl? Do you agree with that, Earl? Or do you have? And so as though Earl's opinion as to the law was going to overcome mine.
Yep.
But nonetheless, we had a number of hardworking lay judges, which we don't have today. But I think we're much better off without them.
Right. That's true.
The probate court had, in Belknap County, we had a lay judge when I first got there, and he was replaced by a lay judge. And then they started using
Lawyers. Yeah. Yeah.
So it was interesting.
Right. You've practiced law for 55 years, and of course, you've seen a lot of changes. We've gone from, the dark ages as far as typewriters are concerned, with carbon paper and no faxes, no photocopiers, and no other electronic gears. One of the major, I think, changes, aside from the electronics, has been the emergence of women in the law profession. And I assume that you've seen that and you've experienced that firsthand.
Yes, of course, we've experienced it in our office. It's been probably 30 years since we've had the first woman in the office.
That's correct.
And we've had them ever since. They've appeared to be I know they're good lawyers.
Right.
They've held their own, and it's certainly been an advance for the bar. If I can change the subject.
5 minutes.
Change the subject. The other things that have happened are lawyer advertising.
Right.
When we first started, lawyers could only advertise once, and that was when you changed your office location. You could put an advertisement in the paper that you were now located somewhere else. And of course now, advertising is all over the place, and I think in many cases it's very misleading. So I don't think that that's an advantage, but it's happened. The other thing is, when I first started practicing, every bar association had its minimum fee schedule. And we had a committee that set the minimum fee for the various things you were doing in that locality. Right. And that, actually, it was considered that you were malpractice or breaking the code if you charged less than the minimum fee. And of course, within a few years, the federal antitrust law saw to it that that was no longer happening.
Right.
So there've been just a ton of changes since then, and I can't say that any of them have been bad, except for the advertising. I think the advertising requires more control than it is.
Right. Peter, you've practiced for 55 years. Why, pray tell, are you still practicing law at your age?
Because I enjoyed it. I enjoy the practice. I enjoy the clients. Perhaps in closing, I'd like to say that the practice of general practice is one where you are in truth a counselor at law. You sit down, you have clients that are regulars. You get to know their family, what they're doing, what they like, what's happening. And they rely on you for advice, not only as a lawyer, but just as a friend. And I think that that's the thing I'm going to miss the most when I do retire in a few months, is the contact with the clients. I mean, there are people I have dealt with for pretty much that 55 years. And it's just a wonderful thing to have people who trust you and to be sure that you earn that trust and keep it.
And Peter, I might say that in my estimation, you've earned that trust over your entire career. And it's been an honor to be your friend and an honor to be your partner and to be mentored by you. And as I've told you so frequently, you have been the moral compass of our law firm, and you're just an outstanding person. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be with you all these years.